Willow Creek was a town that loved its stories, the sweeter the better. A perfect baker, a perfect daughter, a perfect lie. But perfection is fragile, and when 11-year-old Clara Hensley took the stage at the school talent show, she didn't sing. She shattered the town's favorite fairy tale with a single truth. Margaret Thornton was not the mother they thought she was. What followed was not just a trial, but a reckoning. Secrets unraveling in a courtroom where love and cruelty wore the same smile. And at the heart of it all, a girl with a sketchbook full of ghosts, daring to rewrite her own ending. The air inside the courtroom was thick, not just with the scent of polished wood and old paper, but with something heavier: expectation, amusement, doubt. Willow Creek had never seen a case like this before. People packed the gallery, leaning forward on creaking benches, their expressions ranging from morbid curiosity to veiled discomfort. The town was small, the kind where secrets simmered beneath polite smiles, where the illusion of harmony mattered more than the truth. But today, that illusion was being ripped apart. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. "I'm her mother." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the frantic scratching of reporters' pens. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order, but the damage had already been done. The illusion of Maggie Thornton's perfect family had been cracking. Now it was on the verge of collapse. Clara didn't move. She sat frozen in the witness chair, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her mother, her real mother. The woman, Isabel Carver, stood near the door, her posture stiff, like she was bracing for impact. Grease stains smudged the fabric of her worn denim jacket, her work boots scuffed with age, but none of that mattered. It was the eyes. Deep, striking green, just like Clara's. Maggie was on her feet before her lawyer could stop her. "This is insane," she spat, her voice trembling. This woman is a stranger. I've had custody of Clara for years. There's no way." Isabel cut her off. "You stole her." Silence, the kind that swallowed everything in its wake. Maggie's lips parted, but no words came out. Mr. Alden, the prosecutor, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I request a recess to review this new testimony." "No," Isabel said. "No recess. I've waited too damn long." A murmur rippled through the crowd at her bluntness, but she didn't flinch. She didn't look away from Maggie, her expression dark with something fierce and unyielding. "You took her from me," she said, each word measured, heavy. "And now you're going to answer for it." The judge adjusted his glasses, sighing. "Miss Carver, if you wish to be heard in this case, you will wait your turn." He turned to the bailiff. "Escort her to the waiting chamber until—" "No," Clara said suddenly. Every head turned toward her. She gripped the arms of the witness stand, her knuckles pale. Her breath came fast, shallow. "No, I want to hear what she has to say." A beat of hesitation. Then the judge nodded. "Proceed." Mr. Alden stepped forward. "Miss Carver, please take the stand." Isabel moved slowly, deliberately. As she passed Clara, she hesitated, just for a second, just long enough that Clara caught the subtle shift in her expression. Something fragile, something uncertain. Then she settled into the chair, her shoulders squared. The prosecutor approached. "Miss Carver, can you state your relationship to the minor, Clara Hensley?" Isabel's fingers curled around the armrest, tightening. "She's my daughter. And how do you know this?" She let out a breath. "Because I gave birth to her." A stunned hush fell over the room. Clara barely breathed. Maggie's lawyer, Carlyle, forced a thin, knowing smile. "Miss Carver, do you have any proof of this alleged relationship?" Isabel's eyes flicked to him, sharp as a blade. "I do." She reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a folded, worn document. Her birth certificate. Carlyle's smirk faltered. The prosecutor took it, scanning the paper, his brow furrowing. Then he passed it to the judge. The old man studied it for a long moment before looking up. "And what happened, Miss Carver? Why was Clara adopted by the Thorntons?" Isabel swallowed. "Because I didn't have a choice." The words were quiet, but laced with something raw. She shifted in her seat, exhaling sharply. "I was 29, a mechanic. I worked 16-hour shifts just to keep food on the table, and then things got hard, real hard." She hesitated, glancing at Clara, as if afraid of saying too much. Mr. Alden gave her a moment before prompting. "What do you mean by real hard?" Isabel clenched her jaw. "I lost my job. The garage shut down, and I had no savings, no family left to help. Just me and a baby. I tried, but I couldn't keep up with rent. We lost the apartment. Shelters were full. We were on the street for months. A lump formed in Clara's throat. Isabel inhaled sharply. One night, it was so cold, I thought she'd stop breathing. I knew I couldn't do it anymore, so I went to social services. Carlyle seized his moment. So you willingly gave her up? Isabel's hands balled into fists. I did what I thought was best. I was promised that she would go to a good family, that I could get her back when I was stable. She turned, glaring at Maggie. But that's not what happened, is it? Maggie stiffened. Isabel's voice was sharp as steel. Because when I went back, they told me the records were gone, that she had already been placed with a permanent family. Carlyle folded his arms. Do you have any proof of foul play? Isabel's nostrils flared. Yeah, I do. She turned to the judge, her expression tight. I hired someone, a private investigator. He tracked down who signed the adoption papers. The courtroom leaned in. And guess what? Isabel's lip curled. It wasn't social services. The judge frowned. Then who? Isabel's eyes locked onto Maggie. You. The silence was deafening. Maggie let out a choked laugh. This is absurd. It was you, Isabel continued, her voice rising. You knew someone in the system. You used your money, your connections, and you took her. Maggie shot to her feet. That is a lie. But there was something in her voice, a crack, a thin hairline fracture in the perfect image she had worked so hard to maintain. The judge turned to Maggie's lawyer. Mr. Carlyle, do you have a response? Carlyle hesitated. We would need time to verify these claims, Your Honor. The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. Then we will recess until this information is reviewed. Court is adjourned for the day. The gavel came down. The room erupted into chaos, voices rising, reporters scrambling. But Clara sat frozen. She had come into this courtroom expecting a fight, expecting to prove the truth about Maggie. But she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected her mother to find her. At the witness stand sat Clara Hensley, an 11-year-old girl with dark skin and piercing green eyes that held something too heavy for a child to carry. She didn't fidget, didn't let her braids swing as she sat upright, hands gripping the wooden railing. This wasn't just testimony, it was war. Across the room, Margaret Maggie Thornton sat at the defense table, the very picture of wounded innocence. Her blonde hair was swept back into a neat chignon, her pearl earrings catching the courtroom lights just right. A woman who owned a successful bakery, a woman who attended every town fundraiser, a woman who had, up until this moment, been adored. Now, her fingers were locked together so tightly that her knuckles shone white. The judge, an older man with the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much, cleared his throat. Miss Hensley, can you repeat your statement for the court? Clara exhaled slowly. Her voice, when it came, was steady. My name is Clara Hensley, and Maggie Thornton is not my mother. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom like wildfire. Maggie's lawyer, Stephen Carlyle, stood. His suit was sharp, expensive, a stark contrast to Clara's simple cardigan and scuffed sneakers. He adjusted his tie before speaking, his voice smooth, practiced. Clara, you were adopted when you were 4 years old. You have lived with Mrs. Thornton for 7 years. By all legal definitions, she is your mother. No, she's not, Clara said, her jaw tightening. Mothers don't lock their children in closets. They don't hit them when no one's looking. They don't make them lie and say everything's perfect when it's not. Silence, heavy, suffocating silence. Then Maggie's voice, soft, tremulous. Sweetheart, why are you saying these things? Clara turned to look at her. There was no hesitation, no fear in her expression. Because they're true. A sharp intake of breath from someone in the gallery. The judge raised a hand for silence, then turned back to the prosecutor. Mr. Alden, proceed. The prosecutor, a lean man with graying hair and an unshakable stare, nodded. He stepped forward, speaking gently. Clara, can you tell the court about the punishments? Clara's hands tightened on the railing. She had prepared for this moment. She had repeated the words to herself at night, in the dark, when she was alone. Still, saying them here, in front of everyone, made her throat close up. She swallowed. If I did something wrong, if I spilled something, if I didn't smile when she wanted me to, she'd lock me in the pantry, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. A woman in the front row gasped. Clara looked straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the reactions. She would tell me I was ungrateful. that she saved me from being poor, that no one else would ever want me, that I should be thankful she even looked at me. Maggie let out a choked sob. This is ridiculous. The judge silenced her with a look. Mr. Alden nodded. And did she ever hurt you physically? Clara hesitated, not because she was unsure, but because she knew what would come next. She knew how people would look at her. She rolled up her sleeves. The bruises were mostly gone, but faint marks lingered, small, pale scars that only told half the story. The courtroom buzzed. A flicker of something dark passed over Maggie's face before she quickly hid it. My client has never laid a hand on this child in anger, Carlyle said smoothly, standing. This is a troubled girl looking for attention. I don't want attention, Clara interrupted. I just want the truth. The tension in the room was palpable. People shifted uncomfortably. Then the prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness. The judge sighed, adjusting his glasses. Proceed. The doors to the courtroom swung open. A woman stepped inside, tall, with deep brown skin and a close-cropped afro, grease-stained jeans, a heavy jacket, a woman who didn't belong in a place like this but carried herself like she had every right to be here. Her eyes locked onto Clara's. Clara's breath hitched. She knew those eyes, even if she couldn't remember where she had seen them before. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, this is Isabel Carver, and she has come forward with a claim. I don't claim anything, the woman cut in, her voice low, steady. I know exactly who she is. She looked at Clara, and Clara looked back. I'm her mother. Clara sat in the courthouse waiting room, her hands clenched around the edges of her sketchbook. Her pencil hovered over the blank page, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to draw. The courtroom had been a whirlwind. 1 minute, she was fighting to be believed, to tell the truth about Maggie. The next, this woman, Isabel Carver, was standing there, claiming to be her mother. Her real mother. The door creaked open and Clara's grip on her pencil tightened. Footsteps, heavy boots, then a sigh. Didn't think they'd let me in here. Clara looked up. Isabel stood a few feet away, hands shoved into her jacket pockets. She looked different up close, rough around the edges, but not unkind. There was something tired in her eyes, like she'd been carrying the weight of something heavy for too long. Clara didn't say anything. Isabel cleared her throat. I don't know how this is supposed to go. I've never done this before. Silence stretched between them. Clara focused on her sketchbook, pretending to study the grain of the paper. I saw your drawings, Isabel said after a moment. Clara flinched. In the courtroom, Isabel clarified, they're good. A pause. Clara didn't know what to do with that. She wasn't used to people talking about her art like it meant something. I used to draw when I was a kid, Isabel admitted, rubbing the back of her neck. Mostly cars, engines, mechanic stuff. Guess it makes sense since that's what I do now. Clara traced a small circle on the corner of the page. Isabel exhaled. My name is Clara. The words came out sharp, automatic. Something flickered in Isabel's face. I know, she said softly. I picked that name for you. Clara's stomach twisted. She forced herself to keep her expression blank. I don't expect you to believe me, Isabel continued, but I swear I never wanted to leave you. They told me I could get you back. They lied to me. Clara stared at the page. Why now? What? She lifted her head, her green eyes meeting Isabel's. Why now? She repeated, her voice steadier. If you've been looking for me all this time, why did it take this for you to show up? Isabel hesitated. Clara's fingers curled around her pencil. That's what I thought. Isabel let out a slow breath. I won't lie to you, she said. I almost gave up. I spent years trying to track down what happened, but I kept hitting dead ends. Then I heard about the trial. She paused. I knew it had to be you. Clara swallowed hard. I know you don't trust me, Isabel said. Hell, I wouldn't trust me either if I were you. But I came here because I had to. Because Isabel's jaw tightened. She stole you, and I'm not letting her get away with it. Clara wanted to say something, wanted to demand answers, to ask why her entire life had been ripped away from her without her knowing. But the door opened again, and a court officer stuck his head inside. Judge wants you both back inside, he said. Isabel exhaled. Showtime. Clara closed her sketchbook and stood. Neither of them spoke as they walked back toward the courtroom, side by side. The courtroom was different this time. Before, it had felt too big, too heavy, the weight of everyone's stares pressing down on Clara's shoulders. But now, as she stepped back inside, something had shifted. Maybe it was because she wasn't alone. Isabel walked beside her, her boots clicking against the polished floor. Clara kept her gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge the whispers in the gallery. The way the townsfolk leaned in, their curiosity sharpened to a fine edge. They wanted a show. They wanted to see how this would play out, whether the troubled little black girl would crumble or whether the perfect Maggie Thornton would hold her ground. Clara's stomach twisted. Maggie sat at the defendant's table, her lawyer murmuring something into her ear. She didn't look at Clara, not yet. But Clara could feel her presence like a shadow stretching across the room. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Miss Carver, I understand you wish to make a statement regarding this case." Isabel stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor." She straightened her jacket, took a breath, then turned toward the gallery. "My name is Isabel Carver," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It had weight. "I am Clara's mother." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Maggie's lawyer sighed as if he had been expecting this. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this woman has no legal claim here. The adoption was finalized over a decade ago." "The illegal adoption," Isabel interrupted. The lawyer's jaw tightened. Clara stared at her, heart hammering. Isabel wasn't like Maggie. Maggie spoke in a careful, measured way, each word chosen to manipulate, to paint a perfect picture of herself. Isabel, on the other hand, spoke like she was holding back a storm. The judge raised a hand. "Let's keep this orderly." He turned to Isabel. "You're claiming the adoption was fraudulent?" "I am," Isabel said, her voice steady. "I never gave up my daughter. I was told I had no choice." Maggie's fingers curled into a fist on the table. The lawyer scoffed. "And you have proof of this claim?" Isabel lifted her chin. "I do." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a folder, stepping forward to hand it to the bailiff. Clara watched as the judge flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from neutral to something sharper. "These are records from the agency that handled the adoption," Isabel continued. "And this," she pointed as the judge reached a specific page, "is a forged signature." The judge frowned. Maggie's lawyer stepped closer, scanning the document, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I never signed those papers," Isabel said, turning toward the gallery again. "I was lied to. I was told my baby was going to foster care until I could get back on my feet. Instead, she was stolen." The room was silent. Clara's fingers dug into her sketchbook. The judge leaned back in his chair. "This is a serious accusation, Miss Carver. We'll need to verify these documents." "Take your time," Isabel said. "I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Maggie looked up. Her gaze locked onto Clara's, and for just a second, her carefully built mask cracked. There was something desperate in her eyes, something pleading. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Maggie parted her lips, but no words came out. Then, just as quickly as it had slipped, her composure returned. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this is absurd. I have been Clara's mother for 11 years. I have given her everything. What has she jerked her head toward Isabel, done in all that time?" Isabel exhaled sharply. "What have I done?" she repeated. "I've looked for her, I've fought for her, and unlike you, I never hurt her." Maggie flinched. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "Enough." The tension in the room crackled. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "Given the new information presented, I am ordering an official investigation into this adoption. Furthermore, due to the nature of the allegations against Miss Thornton, Clara will be placed in temporary state custody until the matter is resolved." Clara's stomach dropped. State custody. She swallowed hard. Maggie's lawyer protested immediately, but the judge raised a hand. "My decision is final." He turned to Clara. "Miss Hensley, I know this is overwhelming, but I promise we will get to the truth." Clara nodded numbly. Overwhelming didn't even begin to cover it. The echo of silence. Clara sat on the edge of a stiff mattress in a social worker's office, her sketchbook balanced on her lap. It had been hours since the courtroom, and she still felt like she was caught in a fog. The woman sitting across from her, Ms. Reynolds, offered a kind smile. "I know this is a lot to take in." Clara nodded, but didn't speak. She wasn't sure what to feel. Maggie was a liar. She had stolen her, hurt her. But for 11 years she had been the only mother Clara had ever known. And now, suddenly, there was this woman, Isabel Carver, who claimed to be her real mother, who looked like her, who sounded like her, who had a fire in her that Maggie never did. Clara flipped open her sketchbook. Her pencil moved on instinct, tracing the contours of a face. Sharp cheekbones, full lips, a stubborn set to the jaw. Isabel, a knock on the door, made her jump. Miss Reynolds stood and opened it. Izzy. Clara's head snapped up. Isabel leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. Can I talk to her? Miss Reynolds hesitated, then nodded. I'll be right outside. The door closed behind her, leaving them alone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Isabel sighed and pulled a chair over, sitting backward on it. Listen, kid. She caught herself. Clara's grip tightened on her pencil. I don't know how this is going to go, Isabel admitted. Maybe you hate me. Maybe you don't want to see me again after all this. And that's your choice. But I need you to know I never stopped looking. Clara stared at her. Isabel ran a hand through her short curls. I ain't rich. I ain't perfect. But if you give me a chance, I swear I will do everything in my power to make up for lost time. Clara swallowed hard. A choice. For the first time in her life, she had a choice. She looked down at her drawing, then slowly she turned the page and started sketching Isabel's hands. Isabel's hands were rough, worn from years of hard labor, hands that had held wrenches instead of paintbrushes, hands that had built engines instead of packing school lunches. Clara traced them carefully with her pencil, watching how the veins curved, how the knuckles darkened at the edges. She didn't know why she was drawing them. Maybe because hands told the truth. Maggie's hands had always been soft, smooth, always reaching, always taking. She had held Clara's face between them so many times, whispering things that sounded like love but felt like something else, something cold. Isabel's hands were different. They stayed still, resting on her lap, waiting. Clara hesitated, then flipped the page and started a new sketch. This time she drew two hands, one hers, one Isabel's, side by side but not quite touching. Isabel cleared her throat. You're good at that. Clara shrugged. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Isabel spoke again, her voice quieter this time. Do you remember your real name? Clara frowned. Your real name, Isabel repeated. The one I gave you. Clara stared at her, something cold curling in her stomach. Her name was Clara Hensley. She had always been Clara Hensley, hadn't she? I don't know what you mean. Isabel exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Before Maggie, before any of this, you were named after my mother. She swallowed hard. Your name is Amara Carver. Clara flinched. She didn't know why, but the words felt like stepping off a ledge, like she was falling into something deep and unfamiliar. No, she said automatically, that's not my name. Isabel studied her, but she didn't argue. I get it, she murmured after a moment. You've been her daughter for a long time. Clara's chest tightened. I'm not saying you got to change anything, Isabel continued. You don't owe me that. But I just thought you should know. Clara wanted to tell her she was wrong. She wanted to say that she was Clara, that Maggie had always called her that it was hers. But then she thought about how Maggie had chosen everything about her, the clothes she wore, the way she spoke, the things she believed. Maggie had named her too. Hadn't she? Her throat felt tight. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know what to do with that. Isabel nodded, like she understood. You don't have to do anything, she said. Just sit with it. Clara nodded, and for the first time that day, she felt a little less alone. Clara couldn't sleep that night. The courthouse air had been thick with too many voices, too many opinions, too many pairs of eyes slicing into her like knives. Even now, hours later, she could still feel the weight of their judgment pressing against her ribs. She curled into herself on the stiff cot in the Child Protection Center, staring at the ceiling. She should be exhausted. Instead, her mind buzzed, replaying the day in fragments. Maggie's voice, dripping with honeyed falsehoods. She's troubled, Your Honor. I've done everything for her. The social worker's cautious tone. We're still verifying the details, but there are inconsistencies in the adoption paperwork. And Isabel's voice was different, low and steady like the hum of an engine. She's my daughter. She was taken from me. Clara clenched her jaw. She didn't feel like Isabel's daughter, but she wasn't Maggie's either, not really. So who was she? Her stomach twisted. She thought of the name Isabel had given her, Amara Carver. The syllables felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else, someone who had never existed. She sat up, rummaging through her bag until her fingers brushed against her sketchbook. She flipped through it in the dark, letting her fingers trail over the pages. Maggie was in there, her face captured in careful, precise strokes, her smile so perfect, so polished, drawn with an edge of something harder, colder. And now Isabel was in there too. Two women, two worlds, one truth she wasn't ready to face. Her eyes landed on a blank page. Slowly, hesitantly, she put her pencil to paper. She started to draw, not Maggie, not Isabel, not the courthouse or the town that had caged her in whispers. She drew a face she had never seen before. Her own. Not Clara Hensley, not Amara Carver, just a girl trying to figure out who she was. And for the first time in a long time, the page felt like it belonged to her. The air inside the courtroom had changed. Gone was the initial buzz of curiosity, the hushed whispers of townsfolk who had arrived expecting little more than a dramatic scandal. Now there was something sharper in the silence, a tension that settled deep in the bones. The case had turned. No longer just the word of a child against a beloved townswoman, but something more, something undeniable. Clara sat stiffly in the witness box, her small hands gripping the edges of her seat. She had been here before, but today was different. Today her sketchbook lay on the table in front of her, its pages open for the world to see. The prosecutor, Ms. Alden, approached with careful steps. She was a sharp-featured woman in her late 40s, with dark eyes that never wavered. She had handled abuse cases before. She knew the weight of truth when a child carried it. "Clara," she said gently, "can you tell us about these drawings?" Clara swallowed, her throat felt tight. She knew what they would see. The page currently on display was one of her more recent sketches, a dimly lit pantry, the sliver of light from beneath the door casting long, jagged shadows. In the corner, a little girl sat curled into herself, knees hugged tight to her chest. The courtroom was silent. Clara lifted her chin. "That's me," she said. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Miss Alden nodded. "And where is this?" Clara traced the worn wood of the witness stand with her fingers. "That's the pantry in our house. Maggie used to lock me in there when I misbehaved, sometimes for hours." Her voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that came from years of pretending things were fine. Miss Alden let a moment pass. "Did you tell anyone?" Clara hesitated. "I tried once." "Who?" Clara shifted in her seat. "My teacher." Ms. Alden's expression didn't change, but Clara saw the flicker of something in her eyes. "And what happened?" Clara swallowed hard. "Maggie found out. She told me that if I ever lied about her again, she'd send me away, that no one would want me." Her fingers curled into her lap. "So I stopped talking about it." Another murmur. Somewhere in the back of the room, someone cleared their throat. Miss Alden gave Clara a moment before flipping the page. The next sketch was darker. This time, the girl's wrists were bound. The ropes were thick, the knots detailed with precise strokes. The expression on her face, just barely visible in the dim light, was one of quiet resignation. A man in the front row swore under his breath. "Clara," Miss Alden said, her voice softer now, "can you tell us about this drawing?" Clara stared at it. She had drawn it so many times. "That was the worst night," she murmured. "I don't know what I did wrong. I don't think I did anything." Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue. "Maggie tied my hands with a rope. She said she was teaching me to sit still." Clara's breath hitched. "She left me like that all night." A sharp intake of breath from the jury. A woman in the second row shook her head, eyes glistening. For the first time, Maggie flinched. It was barely visible, a twitch at the corner of her mouth, a subtle tightening of her fingers. But Clara saw it. Miss Alden turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a forensic specialist to the stand." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Clara exhaled shakily as a man in a gray suit approached. Dr. Levin, the forensic expert. He had examined her weeks ago, running his fingers over the faint scars on her wrists, his expression unreadable. Now, as he took his seat, he pulled out a stack of documents. "I conducted an examination of Miss Hensley," he stated, his voice even. "She bears several healed scars consistent with prolonged pressure from a binding material such as rope. The patterns suggest forced restraint, not accidental injury. He paused, flipping through his notes. Additionally, her sketches demonstrate a clear recollection of trauma. The detail in her drawings, particularly the use of shadow and proportion, suggests lived experience rather than imagination. A murmur of agreement from the jury box. Miss Alden took a slow step toward him. Dr. Levin, in your professional opinion, do Clara's scars support her claims of abuse? Yes, he said without hesitation. For the first time, Maggie's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The facade of control that Maggie had carefully built was beginning to crack. And Clara finally felt like she was being heard. If the sketches had shaken the town, the next piece of evidence shattered the illusion entirely. Maggie had been clever. She had hidden the abuse behind closed doors, masked her cruelty beneath sweet smiles and careful manipulation. But there were some things even she couldn't cover up. Like the money. Detective Roswell took the stand next, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. He was an older man, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense tone. We ran a financial audit of Mrs. Thornton's accounts, he began. We found significant irregularities. Maggie sat motionless, her face blank. Detective Roswell continued, pulling out a printed document. When Clara Hensley was adopted, she had a trust fund, a small one, set up by a relative of her birth mother. Nothing extravagant, but enough to secure her future. He glanced at Clara. That money was meant to be yours. Clara frowned. She had never known about any of this. The detective turned back to the jury. That fund should still exist, but it doesn't. Over the past 5 years it was drained, withdrawn in increments, transferred into an account belonging to Thornton's Treats. A collective gasp. The bakery? The judge asked, his brow furrowing. Yes, Your Honor, Detective Roswell confirmed. Mrs. Thornton used those funds to renovate her business. New equipment, expansion, advertising. He glanced toward Maggie. We traced every dollar. All eyes turned to her. She didn't move. For years, she had controlled the narrative. She had played the part of the perfect mother, the generous baker, the pillar of Willow Creek. But now, the walls were closing in. Miss Alden took a step forward. So to clarify, Maggie Thornton not only forged adoption papers, but also embezzled her adopted daughter's inheritance to fund her business? Correct. The air in the courtroom thickened. Maggie's lawyer stood abruptly. Objection! This is circumstantial. But the damage was done. A woman in the jury box was shaking her head, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. A man in the gallery muttered something under his breath. And Clara? For the first time since this nightmare began, Clara allowed herself a small, quiet victory. Maggie wasn't untouchable, and the truth was finally coming out. Maggie Thornton had spent years perfecting the art of control. Control over her home, over her business, over the story she fed to the town of Willow Creek. But sitting in the courtroom now, she felt it slipping. It started with Clara's testimony, the quiet, unwavering voice of a child who had lived in fear for too long. Then came the forensic evidence, the financial records, the undeniable proof that Maggie was not the kind-hearted woman she had always pretended to be. Now, as the courtroom settled into a heavy silence, the weight of it pressed down on her like a vice. Her lawyer, Mr. Calloway, shifted in his seat beside her. His usually smooth demeanor had begun to fray at the edges. He had promised her control, that they could spin this, reframe it as a misunderstanding. But as the case unfolded, he had realized, just as she had, that they were losing. And Maggie Thornton did not know how to lose. Judge Graves cleared his throat. Mrs. Thornton, he said, his deep voice reverberating through the chamber, your attorney has requested that you take the stand in your own defense. Do you wish to proceed? Maggie hesitated. For the first time in years, she felt uncertain. The town had always been on her side. She was the woman who had given them warm bread on cold mornings, who had donated to school fundraisers, who had smiled at them from across the counter as though she carried no burdens of her own. Would they believe her now? She glanced toward the jury box. Some of them still looked unsure. Others, however, had already made up their minds. Their faces were hard, their arms crossed. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. She had no choice. Slowly she stood. I will testify, she said. The courtroom murmured. She walked to the stand with the same grace she had always carried, her chin lifted, her shoulders squared. The moment she sat, Mr. Calloway approached, smoothing his tie as he did. "Mrs. Thornton," he began, his voice calm and steady, "let's start from the beginning. Can you tell the jury about the day Clara came into your life?" Maggie folded her hands in her lap. She forced herself to soften her expression, to look, if not sorrowful, then at least burdened. "Of course," she said, her voice warm, nostalgic. "It was a rainy afternoon. She was just a little thing, barely more than a toddler. Her mother had passed, and she had no other family to take her in." She turned her gaze toward Clara, as if looking at her with fondness. "I knew I couldn't turn her away. No child deserves to be alone." The words were carefully chosen. The town had always loved a good story of sacrifice. "And in those early years," Mr. Calloway pressed, "how would you describe your relationship with Clara?" Maggie sighed as if recalling something bittersweet. Difficult at times. She was troubled. She struggled to adapt. She shook her head. "I did my best, but it was never easy. I gave her everything, a home, food, and education. I only ever wanted what was best for her." In the gallery, a few people nodded. A mother in the front row whispered something to her husband. "It was working. And these allegations," Mr. Calloway continued, "the claims that you abused her, that you stole from her, what do you say to that?" Maggie let out a breath, carefully measured. "I am heartbroken," she said. "Truly I am." She looked toward the jury, her voice laced with just the right amount of sorrow. "I loved Clara, I still do, and to hear her say these things," she paused, swallowing, "I can't begin to understand why she would accuse me of such cruelty." Mr. Calloway turned toward the jury. "Mrs. Thornton, are you saying these claims are false?" "Absolutely." A murmur ran through the crowd. Maggie sat back slightly, feeling steadier now. She had done this before, woven truth and fiction into something believable. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could still turn this around. But then, "Mrs. Thornton," Miss Alden's voice cut through the room like a blade. Maggie's stomach tightened. The prosecutor had been waiting for this moment. With deliberate steps, Miss Alden walked toward the witness stand, her sharp eyes never leaving Maggie's face. "You claim that you gave Clara a good life," she said, "that you only ever wanted what was best for her." Maggie nodded. "That's right." "Then why," Miss Alden continued, her voice steady, "did she have scars on her wrists?" A hush fell over the courtroom. Maggie's throat went dry. Why?" Miss Alden pressed, flipping open a file. "Did multiple neighbors report hearing a child crying in your house late at night?" Maggie's fingers curled around the armrests of the chair. "Why?" Ms. Alden continued. "Did an official financial audit show that you embezzled thousands of dollars from her inheritance?" Maggie inhaled sharply. The courtroom was no longer on her side. For the first time since the trial began, she could feel the town turning against her. And as she sat there, her carefully constructed world collapsing piece by piece, she realized she was losing. Maggie Thornton had always known how to handle herself under pressure. She had smoothed over uncomfortable moments at church luncheons, charmed her way through business negotiations, and turned small-town gossip in her favor more times than she could count. But this was different. This wasn't a nosy neighbor asking why Clara never played outside. It wasn't a whispered rumor about a raised voice behind closed doors. This was a courtroom, a judge, a jury, and a prosecutor who had spent weeks pulling at the loose threads of Maggie's carefully woven life until the whole thing was unraveling in front of everyone. And worse, she could feel the town slipping from her grasp. She could see it in the way people shifted in their seats, in the stolen glances between jury members, in the sharp, quiet murmurs spreading through the gallery. They were starting to believe Clara. The prosecutor, Ms. Alden, took another step toward the witness stand, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "You've given the court quite a story, Mrs. Thornton," she said, voice smooth but laced with steel. "A struggling mother doing her best. A child who was difficult, troubled. A tragedy." Maggie gripped the edges of the witness stand, trying to steady herself. "It's not a story," she said firmly. "It's the truth." Miss Alden's lips curled slightly, as if she had been waiting for that. "Then let's talk about the truth." She turned toward the judge's bench. "Permission to present Exhibit F to the jury." Judge Graves gave a curt nod. "Proceed." A screen flickered to life beside the jury box, and there, in front of the entire courtroom, appeared an image, Clara's sketchbook opened to a page smeared with charcoal and shadows. A drawing of a small, dark closet. A child curled inside, knees to chest, scratches on the walls, a thin line at the bottom where light barely seeped through. Another sketch followed, and another, each one darker, more suffocating. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman near the back muttered, "Oh my God." Maggie's stomach twisted. These drawings were submitted as evidence, Miss Alden continued, turning back to Maggie. Clara made them over the years, images of what she couldn't say out loud, images of what happened in your house. Maggie forced out a laugh, though it came out thinner than she intended. They're drawings, just drawings. Children have imaginations. Miss Alden didn't blink. She imagined being locked in a closet for hours. Maggie's mouth tightened. She imagined the bruises, the belt. I never. She imagined you calling her hair ugly. Miss Alden's voice sharpened. That's funny, because we have text messages from a former employee of yours who overheard you complaining about having to deal with that kinky mess every morning. The words landed like a slap. A few jurors recoiled. A reporter in the front row was already scribbling in his notebook. Maggie clenched her jaw. You want us to believe you were a loving mother, Miss Alden pressed, that you took in Clara out of kindness. She tilted her head. But what kind of mother treats their child like that? Aye, and what kind of mother, Miss Alden continued, stepping even closer, steals thousands of dollars from that child's inheritance? Maggie's breath caught. The financial records. She had hoped, prayed, that the evidence wouldn't be solid enough, that her lawyer could argue it away as a misunderstanding, a clerical error. But now, in the cold light of the courtroom, there was no misunderstanding. The money from Clara's biological grandmother, Miss Alden said, flipping through her file, intended for Clara's future, deposited into a trust fund under her name, and yet, somehow, it ended up in your business account. She let the words hang in the air. Maggie felt sweat gathering at the nape of her neck. She could still fix this. She straightened her back, forcing a tremble into her voice. I never stole from her. I managed that money for her. She turned toward the jury, her eyes wide, desperate. She was a child. She couldn't handle it on her own. I only moved it temporarily. You moved it into a bakery that was failing. Maggie froze. Miss Alden flipped open another document. Your business, Thornton's Treats, had been in financial decline for 2 years. Overdue payments, declining revenue, and then suddenly a mysterious cash influx from an account meant for your adoptive daughter. She turned the page, showing the jury a spreadsheet. Clara's money didn't go toward her future, Miss Alden said. It went toward keeping your doors open, toward keeping up the illusion of success. Maggie's hands clenched. This wasn't generosity, Miss Alden said, her voice a knife. It was greed. Cold, Maggie glanced at the jury again. The doubt that had once been in their eyes was gone. Now there was something else. She could feel it spreading through the courtroom, twisting through the rows of seats, curling around the people she had once counted as allies. The town, the one she had spent years shaping, winning over, charming, was slipping away from her. And then, objection, her lawyer's voice rang out, but even he sounded uncertain. This is speculation. The financial records speak for themselves, Mr. Calloway, Judge Graves interrupted. He turned toward Maggie, his sharp gaze cutting through her defenses. And I find myself deeply disturbed by what they show. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Maggie gripped the arms of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had built a life out of control, out of careful manipulation, out of making people see only what she wanted them to see. But now, under the unforgiving lights of the courtroom, the mask was slipping. And for the first time in her life, Maggie Thornton had no idea what to do. For the first time in her life, Maggie Thornton was losing control. She could feel it unraveling thread by thread, like a sweater snagged on a nail. The warmth of the courtroom lights turned unbearable. The once familiar faces in the gallery now looked at her with something new, something ugly. Revulsion, betrayal, and worst of all, pity. She had spent years crafting the image of the perfect mother, the doting businesswoman, the pillar of Willow Creek. Now, in mere minutes, they had destroyed it. Miss Alden paced before the jury, her voice sharp, relentless. Mrs. Thornton, let's be absolutely clear. She turned. eyes gleaming like a predator who knew the kill was close. You didn't just take Clara's money. You stole from her. You locked her in closets. You mocked her for her hair, her background, her very identity. And you expected us to believe you were a mother to her? Maggie's lawyer shot up. Objection, badgering the witness. Judge Graves exhaled sharply. Sustained. Dial it back, Miss Alden. But the damage was done. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Maggie could hear them. People she had shared barbecues with. Neighbors who used to sing her praises at church. They weren't defending her now. She could feel the jury's eyes on her. She could feel Clara's eyes on her. That girl, that ungrateful, lying, manipulative girl. Maggie clenched her jaw. I did my best, she hissed, voice low but full of venom. Miss Alden raised an eyebrow. Your best? Maggie turned, scanning the room, seeking someone who would take her side. But even the judge's face was unreadable. I gave Clara a home, Maggie continued, voice rising. I fed her. I clothed her. Do you know how many children would be grateful for that? From the front row, Izzy Carver tensed, her hands curling into fists. Grateful, Miss Alden repeated, voice soft, dangerous. For what exactly? The beatings? The stolen money? The isolation? Maggie scoffed. She's a child. Children lie. They exaggerate. And Clara was always a troubled kid. She turned to the jury, a desperate smile on her lips. You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to raise a child like that. A child like that. The words hit the courtroom like a slap. Clara sat motionless in her chair, hands curled into fists in her lap. Maggie saw it, and for a fleeting second she realized she had gone too far. But she couldn't stop now. She was broken when I got her. Maggie's voice cracked, the poise she had clung to now dissolving into something raw, something desperate. She came from nothing. No one wanted her. I took her in, and this is how she repays me? A sharp inhale rippled through the gallery. Even Maggie's lawyer had gone still. Miss Alden tilted her head. So let me get this straight. She took a step forward. You believe that Clara, an 11-year-old girl, should be grateful that you abused her, that you stole from her, that you stripped her of her identity? Maggie's breath came in short, furious gasps. I saved her. No, Miss Alden said simply. You didn't. Thick, suffocating silence. Maggie could hear the faint scratching of a pen, the court reporter documenting every single word. She could hear the creak of the wooden benches as people shifted uncomfortably. She could hear the quiet, controlled sniffle of Clara, who hadn't made a sound through the entire testimony, until now. And then finally, Judge Graves cleared his throat. I think we've heard enough. Maggie's stomach plummeted. The judge turned to the jury, his face like stone. We will now move to closing arguments. Maggie gripped the witness stand so tightly her nails dug into the wood. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to win. She was supposed to walk away from this. But as she looked around the courtroom, as she saw the way people were looking at her now, she knew deep in the pit of her stomach that it was over. The courthouse felt different now. The trial was technically still in session, but the battle was already over. The heavy tension that had once gripped the room had shifted, loosened, not into relief, not yet, but into something more uncertain. As the judge called a recess before final rulings, Clara sat in a side chamber of the courthouse, curled up in one of the stiff wooden chairs. The room was small, the kind usually used for lawyers to confer with clients, but at this moment it felt like the world had been reduced to just this space, just this moment. She gripped her sketchbook, her fingers tracing the frayed edges of the pages. Izzy sat across from her, arms crossed, her usual tough expression softened into something more hesitant. She didn't reach for Clara, didn't push. She just waited. Clara stared down at the sketch she had made earlier that day, a drawing of Izzy's hands, strong and oil-stained, with deep lines from years of hard work. It wasn't finished. The shading was uneven, but she kept looking at it anyway. You don't have to decide anything right now, Izzy finally said, her voice rough but careful. I know this is a lot. Clara swallowed hard. A lot, that wasn't the right word. Her entire world had been ripped open. The life she had known, for better or worse, was gone. She had spent years believing she was alone, that she belonged to no one. And now, sitting across from her was proof that she had been wrong. She had a mother, a real one, a living, breathing person who had fought to be here. And yet, the idea of trusting that, of believing it, of opening herself up again, it terrified her. Izzy let out a slow exhale. "Look, kid." She paused, rubbed the back of her neck. "I don't know how to do this the right way. I never got the chance before." Her voice dropped slightly, tinged with something heavy. "But I want to, if you'll let me." Clara clutched her sketchbook tighter. She wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that this woman sitting across from her, with her grease-stained hands and sharp, stubborn eyes, wouldn't hurt her the way Maggie had. But that kind of hope felt dangerous. She turned the sketchbook over in her lap, staring down at the worn cover. A memory surfaced, Maggie's voice, crisp and cool. "You think anyone else is going to want you? No one fights for kids like you. Be grateful for what you have." Clara clenched her jaw. She was wrong. Someone had fought for her. She looked up, meeting Izzy's gaze. "Tell me about my grandmother." Izzy blinked, as if she hadn't expected the question. But then, slowly, a small, sad smile pulled at the corner of her mouth. "She was tough," Izzy said. "Tougher than me. She didn't take crap from anyone." Clara swallowed. "Did she draw?" Izzy huffed a quiet laugh. "No, but she could sew anything. Said she liked making something out of nothing. Guess that's kind of the same, huh?" Clara traced the edge of her paper. Making something out of nothing. Maybe she could do that too. Maybe she could start over. Maybe she didn't have to be alone anymore. The recess ended, and the courtroom filled once again, the air heavy with anticipation. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table, her sketchbook clutched in her lap, her fingers ghosting over its worn cover. Across the room, Maggie sat rigid, her perfect composure cracked at the edges. Her hands were folded on the table, white-knuckled, her gaze flicking between Clara and the judge as though willing reality to bend in her favor. But reality wasn't bending, it was closing in. Judge Holloway adjusted his glasses, his deep-set eyes scanning the room before settling on Clara. His voice was steady, neutral, but carried an unmistakable weight. "Miss Hensley, you've had the opportunity to speak with Miss Carver. You've also heard the findings regarding Miss Thornton's actions. The court recognizes that, despite these circumstances, you've spent most of your life in her care, so before I rule, I'd like to hear directly from you." The room went silent. Clara felt the weight of every gaze pressing down on her. The lawyers, the judge, the murmuring townsfolk in the gallery, everyone was waiting. Even Maggie, especially Maggie. Clara had spent years learning to measure her words, to shape them into something that wouldn't provoke Maggie's sharp disapproval. Even now, under the sterile glow of the courthouse lights, she could feel the ghost of that fear wrapping around her ribs, whispering that if she said the wrong thing, Maggie would find a way to take it all back. But Maggie had no power here. Not anymore. Clara rose to her feet, her legs unsteady, but her voice, when she spoke, was not. "I used to think," she began, voice quiet but firm, "that being chosen was the same thing as being loved." Maggie flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Clara continued, "I thought that because Maggie picked me, because she took me in when no one else did, that I owed her everything, even when she hurt me, even when she told me I wasn't enough. I thought," her fingers curled into her palms, "that maybe she was right." A ripple of discomfort spread through the room, but no one interrupted. Clara lifted her chin. "But I know better now. Being loved isn't about being someone's project. It's not about owing them for the bare minimum. It's not about control." She turned, and for the first time, really looked at Izzy. "It's about being fought for." Izzy's lips parted, a sharp inhale of breath. Clara swallowed the tightness in her throat and turned back to the judge. "I don't want to go back to Maggie." Her voice didn't waver. "I want to go home with my mom." The words landed in the room like a stone dropping into water. Maggie shot to her feet, her chair screeching against the floor. Her lawyer grasped her arm, a frantic attempt to rein her in, but Maggie yanked away. "You're making a mistake," she spat, her voice losing its carefully measured polish. "You're a child. You don't know what's best for you." Judge Holloway's gavel slammed against the bench. "Miss Thornton, sit down, or I will have you removed from this courtroom." But Maggie wasn't listening anymore. Her mask had cracked, and everything that had been simmering beneath it, all the resentment, all the entitlement, all the fear, was spilling out. "You think she'll take care of you?" Maggie's voice was sharp, acidic. "You think she's stable? That she'll keep you in a real home? You'll be living in filth in some rundown shack. That's enough, the judge barked. Clara stared at Maggie, at the sheer desperation in her expression. For the first time, she realized it had never been about love. It had never even been about her. It had been about control, and Maggie was losing it. Izzy rose slowly, standing beside Clara, her stance firm. You don't get to define what home looks like for her anymore. Maggie let out a strangled sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. You think you're any better than me? She hissed. You left her. I gave her everything. She was mine. Clara flinched. Maggie's lawyer paled. The gallery, silent before, erupted. Judge Holloway slammed the gavel again, harder this time. That will be the last outburst I allow in this court. Miss Thornton, you are hereby stripped of all legal guardianship over Miss Hensley. Your fraudulent adoption, as well as the theft of her trust fund, will be submitted for criminal charges. Custody is awarded to Miss Isabel Carver. Maggie's face crumpled. Clara exhaled shakily, the words barely sinking in before she felt Izzy's hand, warm, steady, on her back. She looked up. Izzy's voice was soft but firm. Let's go home, kid. For the first time in her life, Clara stepped forward, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but because she chose to. And she didn't look back. The town of Willow Creek disappeared in the rearview mirror. The courthouse, the whispers, the weight of that old life, it was all shrinking into the distance. Clara sat in the passenger seat of Izzy's truck, her sketchbook resting on her lap. The pages fluttered slightly in the wind from the open window, but she wasn't drawing. She was just watching. She had never seen the world like this before. Maggie never let her roll the windows down in her car. Too messy, too loud. But now the wind was rushing against her face, tugging at her braids, filling her lungs with something crisp and unfamiliar. Freedom. Izzy had one hand on the wheel, the other tapping rhythmically against the dashboard to the beat of the old blues song playing from the truck's crackling speakers. She hadn't said much since they left the courthouse, but she didn't have to. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It wasn't heavy. It just was. Clara glanced sideways at Izzy. The woman still had grease under her fingernails from the morning's work at her garage. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, revealing the rough, callous skin of someone who had spent her life working with her hands. Those hands had been shaking when the judge awarded her custody. Not from fear, from relief. Clara swallowed. She wasn't used to this, to someone fighting for her. Hey, Izzy said suddenly, pulling her from her thoughts. You good? Clara blinked, then nodded quickly. Yeah. Izzy glanced at her unconvinced. You hungry? Clara hesitated. Hunger was a tricky thing. At Maggie's house, meals were always served at precise times, with precise portions. Clara had learned not to ask for seconds. She shifted in her seat, I guess. Izzy smirked, reaching over to ruffle her braids. That was a terrible answer. Lucky for you, I don't take I guess for an answer. Clara stiffened at the sudden touch. Izzy's hand froze. For a split second, there was nothing but stillness. Then Izzy pulled back, her fingers curling slightly like she wasn't sure what to do with them anymore. Sorry, kid. That okay? Clara forced a nod. Izzy studied her for a second longer, then exhaled, turning her eyes back to the road. All right, we'll work on that. The words weren't pitying. They weren't demanding. They were just there. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt like she could breathe. They stopped at a roadside diner a few towns over. It was the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a neon open sign that flickered every few seconds. The air smelled like coffee and fryer grease, and the waitress behind the counter looked like she had been working there since the dawn of time. Clara hesitated at the entrance. Maggie never took her to places like this, too cheap, too loud. She felt Izzy watching her, waiting. Then gently, Izzy nudged her forward. Pick any booth you want, kid. The choice was hers. Clara let out a slow breath and picked the one by the window. They slid into their seats, and Izzy grabbed a menu, immediately flipping to the burger section. All right, so here's how this works, she said, tapping the page. You can order whatever you want. Doesn't have to be healthy, doesn't have to be small. If you want fries, get fries. If you want a milkshake, get a milkshake. Hell, get two. Nobody's gonna stop you. Clara bit her lip. Are you sure? Izzy paused. Something unreadable flickered across her face. Then she leaned forward, elbows on the table. You ever had a burger so big you had to hold it with two hands? Clara shook her head. Izzy grinned. Then today's your lucky day, kid. The waitress came over, and when it was Clara's turn to order, she hesitated for a second before taking a risk. I'll have the... She glanced at Izzy, who nodded encouragingly, the double bacon cheeseburger, and a chocolate milkshake. Izzy beamed. The waitress smirked. Good choice, sweetheart. That's my favorite. Clara felt something strange. Warm, small, like maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to want things. To choose, and no one was going to take that away from her. The food came, and Izzy wasn't kidding. The burger was huge. Clara picked it up carefully, her fingers barely wrapping around the bun. She glanced up at Izzy, unsure of how to even start. Izzy just grinned and took a giant, messy bite of her own burger. Ketchup smeared at the corner of her mouth. Best way to eat it, she said through a mouthful of food, is to not care how ridiculous you look. Clara laughed. The sound startled her. It had been so long since she had laughed like that, since she had felt something that wasn't fear. Izzy's grin softened, and she nudged the ketchup bottle toward her. Eat up, kid. We've got a long ride home. Home. The word didn't feel heavy anymore. It didn't feel like a prison. It felt possible, and for the first time in her life, Clara thought maybe, just maybe, she was ready for it. The new town wasn't big, but it was busy in its own way. Cars rumbled down the narrow streets, their horns honking in a rhythm that felt familiar, yet completely foreign to Clara. People walked in and out of small shops, chatting with street vendors, waving at each other like they had known each other their whole lives. It wasn't like Willow Creek. No one here looked at Clara like she was out of place. No one whispered about what she had done or who she had accused. She was just another kid stepping out of a truck with her sketchbook tucked under her arm. And Izzy? Izzy belonged here. She pulled into the driveway of a small two-story house with peeling paint and a cluttered front porch. A rusted motorcycle leaned against the garage, half covered by a tarp. Tools were scattered across the wooden steps leading to the front door, along with half-finished projects that Izzy clearly meant to get back to but never did. It wasn't neat. It wasn't perfect, but it felt alive. Clara stepped out of the truck, her sneakers crunching against the gravel. Well, Izzy said, throwing open the truck door, here we are. It ain't much, but it's home. Clara didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring up at the house, her fingers tightening around the edges of her sketchbook. Izzy hesitated. Then she hooked her thumbs into the belt loops of her jeans and cleared her throat. You want to see your room? Clara nodded. The stairs creaked beneath their weight as they climbed up to the second floor. Izzy pushed open a door near the end of the hallway, revealing a small bedroom with a slanted ceiling and a window overlooking the street. The bed was unmade, the walls were bare, a small desk sat in the corner, covered in old sketches that weren't hers. Izzy scratched the back of her head. I didn't have time to fix it up much, but we can change anything you want. New paint, new furniture. Hell, if you want a whole damn mural on the wall, we'll figure it out. Clara stepped inside slowly, running her fingers along the desk. The drawings were rough, pencil sketches of engines, motorcycles, and cars. You draw? She asked, glancing at Izzy. Izzy chuckled. Used to, mostly stuff for the garage. Nothing as good as yours, though. Clara swallowed. This wasn't Maggie's house. There were no rules about where she could stand or what she could touch. It felt strange, new, and terrifying. You hungry? Izzy asked after a moment. Clara hesitated. We just ate. Izzy smirked. That was hours ago, kid. Clara hadn't noticed. She just nodded, following Izzy back downstairs. The kitchen was messy, not in a disgusting way, but in the way that meant someone actually used it. Dishes were stacked in the sink. A radio sat on the counter, playing an old jazz song that crackled through the speakers. The fridge had magnets holding up faded photos, most of them of people Clara didn't recognize. Izzy opened the fridge and pulled out a carton of eggs. You know how to cook? Clara shrugged. Maggie didn't let me. Izzy froze. It was small, barely even noticeable, but Clara caught it. Then Izzy shut the fridge, set the eggs on the counter, and turned to face her. Well, she said, crossing her arms, you want to learn? Clara blinked. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't that. Okay. Izzy grinned. Good answer. She grabbed a frying pan, cracked an egg with one hand, and dropped it onto the sizzling surface. All right, first rule of cooking, if you burn something, you lie. You tell people it's charred for extra flavor, and you own it. Clara bit back a smile. That's not how cooking works. Sure it is, Izzy said, flipping the egg with way too much confidence. The yolk splattered everywhere. Clara laughed. It was small, quiet, barely more than a breath. But it was real. Izzy winked at her, wiping her hands on a rag. Your turn, kid. Clara picked up an egg. She cracked it too hard, and half the shell fell into the pan. Izzy snorted. Okay, she said, holding up her hands. Maybe we'll work on that part first. Clara grinned. For the first time in a long time, the weight in her chest didn't feel so heavy. That night, Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She wasn't scared. She wasn't trapped, but she wasn't sure if she belonged here yet either. She turned onto her side and reached for her sketchbook. Her fingers hesitated before she started to draw. Not Maggie, not the courtroom, not the memories that still haunted the edges of her mind. She drew Izzy with her grease-stained hands and messy kitchen. Izzy flipping an egg like an idiot. Izzy smiling. By the time she fell asleep, the sketchbook was still open on her lap. And for the first time in years, Clara dreamed of something other than running. The garage was alive with movement. The scent of motor oil clung to the air, mixing with the faint aroma of coffee from the corner. Clara sat cross-legged on the workbench, sketchbook open, her pencil dancing across the page. She was drawing Izzy, not the way the woman saw herself, but the way Clara saw her. Strong, steady, a protector. Izzy wiped her hands on a rag and leaned over, peering at the sketch. Damn, she muttered. Didn't know I looked that badass. Clara smirked. You do. For the first time in weeks, it felt normal. Not like she was waiting for something terrible to happen. Not like she was holding her breath. But then, there was the letter. It sat unopened on the shelf, tucked beneath a stack of papers, but Clara could feel its presence like a weight pressing on her chest. Maggie's handwriting was unmistakable, curled and neat, like everything in her carefully controlled world. Izzy noticed her staring at it. You don't have to read it, she said, voice soft but firm. You owe her nothing. Clara swallowed. I know. And she did. But still that night, when the garage was quiet and the world outside had settled into the hum of crickets and distant traffic, she reached for the envelope. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper. My dearest Clara, I know you must hate me. I don't blame you, but one day you'll understand that everything I did was out of love. Clara's fingers curled around the edges of the paper. Love? You were never meant to be taken from me. You were mine, Clara. You were supposed to be my daughter. And I tried so hard to make you perfect, to protect you from the life you would have had with her. Her breath caught with her, Izzy. She kept reading. But I was not alone in this. There are things you don't know, things you should know. I didn't take you by myself. I had help. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to understand, you were never just an accident. You were chosen. The letter ended there, but the final words clawed at her mind. She was chosen. By who? She didn't realize she had crumpled the letter in her fist until Izzy's voice cut through the silence. You okay? Clara looked up, heart hammering. She could lie, say it was nothing, pretend she had thrown the letter away and moved on. But she had spent too long pretending. She smoothed out the paper and handed it to Izzy. I think there's more to this, she whispered. Izzy read quickly, her jaw tightening. Damn it, she muttered. That woman just won't quit, huh? Clara let out a breathless laugh. Apparently not. Izzy tossed the letter onto the workbench. You want to dig into this? Clara hesitated. The past had already taken so much from her. But something in her gut told her this wasn't over. She met Izzy's gaze. Yes, she said, I do. Izzy grinned. She grabbed her keys, tossing them into the air before catching them with a smirk. Then let's raise some hell. And just like that, the past wasn't a weight anymore. It was a door. One Clara was finally ready to open.